Chikatilo's younger sister, the 28-year-old Chikatilo, married.
He was living with his sister, and she had a spinster friend, and the two of them were put together, and having no better prospects, they married.
His new wife, Feodosia, was a 24-year-old daughter of a coal miner.
At last he had found a person in life with whom he could communicate and relate and have something approaching normal emotional closeness.
He never was capable of normal sexual relations with her, but there was, through a kind of masturbation and insemination process, an effort made to conceive children.
In 1965, they were successful. The birth of their daughter, Luda, was followed by a son, Yura, 4 years later. Chikatilo found work as a communications technician. Throughout this time, he continued his studies, working towards degrees in Marxist-Leninism, engineering, and Russian literature. The family had a balconied second-floor flat in a nondescript block. By Russian standards, it was a pleasant life. Outwardly, Andrei was a good husband and father. Feodosia had little reason to complain.
She might have felt, well, he's a party member, he brings home a salary, he's not drunk, and he doesn't beat me. Those last two things would set him apart in a favorable way from a lot of men in the Soviet Union.
His marriage, his children, his membership in the Communist Party, that's what everyone saw. But that wasn't his true personality.
Chikatilo had erected a modest and respectable facade for the world to see. Inside, however, he was desperately frustrated.
Certainly the fact that he was fundamentally impotent enraged him greatly because he felt that in some ways he was a superior person, having gotten 3 university degrees.
I think he felt throughout his life that that impotence was probably the most fundamental adjective you could use to describe him.
In 1970, Chikatilo accepted a job in a secondary school. As a teacher, the 34-year-old hoped to find acceptance and respect, and yet instead he found constant humiliation. His students didn't take him seriously. They refused to behave and smoked right in front of him in the classroom.
He was altogether not the kind of person that would hold the attention of a class of children, and they mocked him.
He was nicknamed the Goose by his students, and goose in Russian is kind of like jerk in English. It's someone who inspires zero respect.
Worse, Chikatilo found himself enraged by the sight of young people around him falling in love and, in his mind, engaging in sexual activity.
One thing that he wanted to change about himself and couldn't change was his sexual impotence.
He felt the world had somehow inflicted a tremendous injustice on him. Any lowlife could enjoy the pleasures of sexuality, the joys of love, but he, Chikatilo, the educated, the brilliant, the special, the genius, could not, and that was a source of his fundamental rage.
In the early 1970s, Chikatilo responded to his anger and frustration by secretly molesting students, both male and female.
He felt so profoundly rejected by adults, he was unable to have sexual relationships with consenting adults, so he instead went to vulnerable children.
In 1974, he was fired when allegations of his sexual misconduct with students became known.
Rather than take the responsibility for exposing him, the director of the school simply got rid of him. And it was typical of what might happen in a Soviet society and probably would happen in any society.
Because the incidents were kept quiet, Chikatilo could simply relocate. He moved his family to the nearby town of Shakhty. There he found a new position, teaching at vocational school number 33.
Chikatilo's wife knew that he had little problems. He was involved with bothering the children at school, but they had put that behind them, and she had forgiven her husband.
But unknown to his wife and family, Andrei Chikatilo was constructing another life. He bought a second secret house for himself. It was a dilapidated three-room shack on a quiet back street called Mezhevoy Lane. And it was the perfect setting for murder. In Shakhty, Russia, Andrei Chikatilo seemed to be a devoted family man. His inner life, however, was filled with dark and murderous desires. In 1978, he began to turn these feelings into action. First, he acquired a small shack in a rundown neighborhood. In December, he took a 9-year-old girl there. Her name was Yelena Zakotnova. Her friends called her Lena. He'd met her at a bus stop and offered her something Soviet children rarely enjoyed, bubble gum. She agreed to follow him to the house.
He encountered this girl and had first discovered with her that violence on the body of a girl was something that would get him excited.
As he began to molest her, he grew increasingly excited and wanted more direct sexual contact with her.
He was unable to perform sexually, so he used a knife instead.
It was the moment when he discovered that murder was his passion. After that, he knew himself in a new way.
Afterward, he carried Lena to the nearby Grushevka River. He set her body in the water, then tossed her school bag after her. She was found 2 days later. Although policemen investigating the case came across some bloodstains near Andrei Chikatilo's secret house, he was not considered the prime suspect.
The problem is, from the point of view of the police, that he had no criminal record. He was a party member. He had a wife. He had children. He did not fall into any of the categories that they were used to looking for criminals in.
Rather than focusing on Chikatilo, police found someone they deemed a more appropriate suspect, a local man who had spent time in prison for rape. He was later convicted and executed. Having killed for pleasure, Andrei Chikatilo was now able to erase the sense of impotence he'd felt all his life.
He had gained a piece of self-knowledge that he could never shake, which was that what turned him on was powerlessness and ultimately the murder of another person.
Still, coming so close to being caught had frightened Chikatilo. For the next 2 years, he went to work, spent time with his wife and children, read the papers, and waited. He quit teaching to become a supply supervisor, or tolkach, a position unique to the dysfunctional Soviet economic system, where contracts for raw materials often went unfulfilled.
The job of a tolkach was to go around to the various enterprises and try to get them to send the cement or send the rubber or send the steel or whatever it was that was necessary. It was normal for him to go on the road for several days to visit the supplying enterprises for his own enterprises and be gone without any supervision.
It was not a particularly prestigious job for a man of Chikatilo's education. He traveled by train to various factories, trying to maintain the image of a dutiful Soviet citizen.
He does have a struggle. I don't think he just gives himself over to, I am evil personified. I think he says, what I'm thinking, what I'm wanting to do is not healthy.